Washington played the central role in leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. If American policy succeeds and the Russians are losing to the Ukrainians on the battlefield, Putin might turn to nuclear weapons. This new rhetoric was designed to serve one simple purpose: to allow the West to blame Putin for the outbreak of trouble in Ukraine. It was only when the Ukraine crisis broke out in February 2014 that the United States and its allies suddenly began describing Putin as a dangerous leader with imperial ambitions, and Russia as a serious military threat that had to be contained. What happened? This new rhetoric was designed to serve one simple purpose: to allow the West to blame Putin for the outbreak of trouble in Ukraine. And now that the crisis has turned into a full-scale war, it is imperative to make sure that he alone is blamed for this disastrous turn of events. This blame game explains why Putin is widely viewed as an imperialist here in the West, even though there is hardly any evidence to support that perspective. Let me now turn to the real cause of the Ukraine crisis and ultimately the Ukraine war. The taproot is the American-led effort to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. That strategy has three prongs. One, integrating Ukraine into the EU. Two, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. You all know about the Orange Revolution. And three, and most importantly, incorporating Ukraine into NATO. The strategy was set in motion at NATO's annual summit in Bucharest in April 2008, when the alliance announced that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. That's in quotes, will become members. Russian leaders responded immediately with outrage, making it clear that this decision was an existential threat to Russia, and they had no intention of letting either country join NATO. According to a respected Russian journalist, Putin, quote, flew into a rage and warned that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will do so without Crimea and the eastern regions. It will simply fall apart. That's Putin talking in 2008. William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. This is at the time of the Bucharest summit. He wrote a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that succinctly describes Russian thinking about Ukraine joining NATO. You want to pay very careful attention to what Burns said, and then what I'm going to tell you Angela Merkel has recently said. This is Burns. This is his memo. He's the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. It's his memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. NATO, he said, would be seen as throwing down the strategic gauntlet. Today's Russia will respond. Russian-Ukrainian relations will go into a deep freeze. It will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Burns, of course, was not the only policymaker who understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was fraught with danger. I might note that in all of Putin's public statements during the months leading up to the war, there is not a scintilla of evidence that he was contemplating conquering Ukraine and making it part of Russia, much less attacking other countries in Eastern Europe. Other Russian leaders, including the defense minister, the foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador to NATO, to Washington, the Russian ambassador to Washington, also emphasized the centrality of NATO expansion for causing the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly at a press conference on January 14th, 2022, when he said, "The key to everything," I'm quoting Lavrov now, "the key to everything is the guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward." Nevertheless, the efforts of Lavrov and Putin to get the United States and its allies to abandon their efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border failed completely. Secretary of State Tony Blinken responded to Russia's mid-December demands by simply saying, quote, "There is no change, there will be no change." Putin then launched an invasion of Ukraine to eliminate the threat he saw from NATO. At the same time, it means that the United States is deeply committed to making sure that Russia loses. The Biden administration has now invested so much in the war, both materially and rhetorically, that a Russian victory would represent a devastating defeat for Washington. Obviously, both sides can't win. Moreover, there's a serious possibility that one side will begin to lose badly. There is a serious possibility of that. If American policy succeeds and the Russians are losing to the Ukrainians on the battlefield, Putin might turn to nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, told the Senate this past May that this was one of the two situations that might lead Putin to use nuclear weapons if he is losing in Ukraine. For those of you who think it's unlikely that he would turn to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation if he's losing in Ukraine, I would remind you that NATO planned to use nuclear weapons in similar circumstances during the Cold War. We were planning to use nuclear weapons in West Germany if the Warsaw Pact overran West Germany. If we were losing against the Warsaw Pact in West Germany, we were going to turn to nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. That's what we're talking about Putin doing. You don't think he'll do it? In conclusion, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is a colossal disaster, which, as I noted at the start of my talk, will lead people all around the world to search for its causes. Those who believe in facts and logic will quickly discover that the United States and its allies are mainly responsible for this train wreck. The April 2008 decision to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO was destined to lead to conflict with Russia. The Bush administration was the principal architect of that fateful choice, but the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations have doubled down on that policy at every turn, and America's allies have dutifully followed. Even though Russia's leaders made it perfectly clear that bringing Ukraine into NATO would be crossing the brightest of red lines, the United States simply refused to accommodate Russia's deepest security concerns and instead moved relentlessly to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. The tragic truth is that if the West had not pursued NATO expansion, into Ukraine, it is unlikely there would be a war in Ukraine today, and Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. In essence, Washington played the central role in leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. History will judge the United States and its allies with abundant harshness for its remarkably foolish policy on Ukraine. Thank you.